Formula One returned to the Lone Star State, Austin, Texas. A classic race as Formula One went back to the USA for the second of 3 times this year. COTA, a track that nearly always provides entertainment, but it was the post-race penalties that are unfortunately the talking point. Lewis Hamilton, Charles Leclerc, both in breach of plank wear, resulting in a rare post-race disqualification. So if you turned off your telly after you saw the podium, let's explain. Huge ramifications for the battle for second in the championship as well. I'm Martyn Lee from the Autosport podcast, and joining me to break down how this all affects the results, I'm joined by Matt Kew, on location in Austin, and back here, JBL. Gentlemen, welcome. So, Matt, let's get straight into the thick of things. We are obviously making this video much later than we planned because we got the news that 4 cars had been chosen to be tested for that particular test that they do post-race. 2 of them passed and 2 of them failed. And it's not really up for negotiation, kind of a black and white issue, isn't it? Lewis and Charles disqualified. Can you tell us more from what you've just been through?
Absolutely. And I think the first thing I'd say is it's really not a black and white issue for me personally. So as you say, 4 cars have been tested, 2 compliant, 2 not. 2 have been disqualified. So that means there's 16 cars that haven't been tested, and they could be, right now, they are Schrodinger's cars. They're both compliant and non-compliant because they haven't been tested. So we do have a case where potentially 8 illegal cars have been promoted into a points position. That opens up a grey area, a bit of a can of worms, really. That's a bit of an argument to have. But yeah, so what we have is sprint race format here in Austin. So you get one 60-minute practice session before Parc Fermé rules come into effect. So that means after that, you're very limited with what setup changes you can make. So they've done that, and they've experienced Austin, which is significantly bumpier than last year, and that's despite resurfacing turns 12, 14, 15, 16. So the circuit, I did a run of it. It looks a bit like a patchwork quilt because there's just splodges of new tarmac. But because it's so much bumpier, and they've only had a limited window to get their setup, some of them have got it wrong, basically. We're running too low or too soft. So over the bumps, there's big compressions, and they're grounding out, and they've worn away the plank, which has a certain tolerance of plus or minus 0. something of a millimeter. I think it's 0.9 of a millimeter, and they've exceeded that. And by the book, that is a slam dunk technical breach, and it's a disqualification. I think the last time we had a floor disqualification was the United States Grand Prix in 2001 with Jarno Trulli for Jordan. I think I'm correct in that. Occasionally it happens in F2. And then you have, and I'm absolutely not accusing any teams of anything here, but you'll have seen that for the race, both Haas and Aston Martin cars started from the pit lane and made setup changes. So you do wonder with the random technical checks, was there ever an element of drivers or teams hedging their bets, having seen after qualifying the sprint race that the planks were marginal and the ride heights were too low, that they thought, do we crack into this and make sure we're fully compliant, or do we hope we're not one of the 4 cars to have our checks? So very, very interesting matter. Instant breaking news stories all live on autosport.com, and we're going to have a nice healthy bit of analysis for readers on the Monday morning.
Yeah, so obviously we to kind of like start off with, why do we have this plank? Well, that's there to ensure that teams aren't lowering the cars to a certain degree, and you have these wear measurements to basically enforce that regulation. And so they'll test the thickness of the plank at the end of each race. As you say, not for everybody, for certain select cars that they choose, I think at random, but I think officially anyway. So what they'll do is they'll check, and if it's 10 millimeters or greater, then they're absolutely fine. If it's less than that, then that's when you hit a problem because you're running that car too low, basically. It was a rule that was basically introduced back in 1994 when they had all the sort of big changes, in the wake of Senna's death and all of the other high-profile accidents at the time. People were sort of getting very kind of afraid that the cars were being run too low, and this is something that has continued. The difference now is that you sort of have like a titanium skid block to kind of, I guess, prevent wear to the plank. So it is a little bit extreme that you end up with that measurement and you're getting certain degrees of plank wear. It's difficult here in Austin because the circuit's very, very bumpy. So, but you need to change your car to cope with that. There are cars that have kind of been unsettled by the bumps, so the teams have had to raise the ride heights, and so that's what you've got to do. It's all a big compromise, really. And so if you've come back to the stewards and they're scrutineering your car, and it's less than what it's supposed to be, it's pretty much, I think, every instance that I can think of has been slam dunk.
Does this, JB, I'll ask you this. This is disappointing for Mercedes-Benz, a very, very professional Formula One team. But we've seen with Toto Wolff away for a couple of races, Lewis and George too close on track, crashing out, of course, in Qatar. And now we have the engineering team taking a lot of heat after this mistake, arguably giving a bit of a break to the strategy team, who also didn't cover themselves in glory. Because do you think Lewis Hamilton's strategy was compromised this weekend? Could he have won the Grand Prix? And will the strategists be breathing a bit of a sigh of relief because at least Toto will be shouting at somebody else first?
I'm not 100% sure it's quite as simple as he would have won the race, but it was a point where Mercedes was looking to stick to a one-stop strategy, or looking to go for a one-stop strategy rather, and went to both drivers and said, can you extend this opening stint and so that we can do a monster stint on the hard tyre and basically have track position, so when Verstappen and Norris came out for their second stints, having stopped for the second time, they'd theoretically be well up the road and potentially have enough buffer to counter off any sort of tyre degradation, or tyre offset rather. So that, I think that was the intention, but it became sort of apparent quite quickly that, especially when Hamilton was kind of mid-stint and he was trying to extend, he was finding it very, very difficult. And it became apparent that the degradation was a lot higher than a lot of people had anticipated. So it put them in a bit of a difficult situation because they'd sort of half committed and basically had to cut their second stint short, in a sense, to accommodate a second stop. And it was a little bit like, I don't know, it's almost like representative of the car almost. They'd come up with this sort of like off the cuff solution with regards to their side pods, and they've had to cut that short to kind of go in tandem with everybody else. And they've kind of had to do that with their pit strategy as well in this race. So I think it's maybe them behind the eight ball a little bit, trying to innovate maybe too much, and it's just not something that entirely works. So yeah, it was a difficult one to call, and I don't know if, had Hamilton been on the same strategy as Verstappen and Norris, I don't know if I could definitively say that he would have won the race, but I think he certainly had the pace to give it a good go.
Well, let's talk about Lando Norris, 100th race in Formula One. And for the first half of the Grand Prix, the first 28 of the 56 laps, he led the way and he set the pace. He seemed to be managing it well. It always looked, once he started mirroring Verstappen's pit stop strategy, it was a kind of a case of, well, if you're going to do what the fastest car is doing, then wait and see how that plays out. Sometimes when one zigs, you've got to zag. But either way, that's what they did, and ended up coming home third on the road behind Verstappen and Hamilton, but of course second in the final classification. So that's 4 podiums in a row. His points today leapfrogs McLaren over Aston for that big battle for fourth in the constructors. Matt, what was the case with Lando as those stint lengths were going on, and that McLaren seemed to get less and less competitive versus the cars it was up against?
Yeah, so McLaren, the other way to Mercedes, they said they were immediately targeting the victory. They identified Verstappen as the main threat, having jumped Leclerc for victory, but they were absolutely going for the win. There was no element of there's always an element of pace management, but there was no element of like consolidation. They were absolutely going for glory. But I think the trend we've seen over recent races is that Red Bull, or everyone's a lot closer to Red Bull in qualifying. And that's a lot of it is down to the tyres, really. I think the soft tyres bring the field together, and then you get onto the mediums and then the hards, and Red Bull stretches away. I think that was brought together a little bit on I think the hard tyres, but I think it's on the mediums where Verstappen had the pace edge. Certainly, I was watching it and thought when And they were zooming in on the Red Bull pit wall, weren't they? And Hannah, the strategist, and I'm thinking, are they, is there a pressure here? I think they've fumbled the strategy that Norris has to stay out and get it. But you saw how it paid off for Leclerc. The one stop did, gradually become apparent that it was suboptimal, I suppose, if F1 parlance. So which is why they brought Norris in. And yeah, at the end, his pace just dropped off, didn't he? He cooked those tyres. But it was a strong performance, and I think that the line from McLaren is that the sort of, we're really happy to be upset with P2 because it shows the progress we've made. But I think, as the team notes, they were weakest here at turn 12, which is the bottom end of the straight, off throttle, slow speed corner. That's where McLaren is weakest. But there's one corner of that at Austin. So this was probably, if you look at slower speed, Brazil, Las Vegas street track, Mexico fiddly sequences, Abu Dhabi fiddly, potentially this was Red Bull, potentially this was McLaren's last chance at going for glory.
We can't not talk about Williams and a double points finish, but Logan Sargeant as well, an American on American soil, getting his first point in Formula One. Okay, so it wasn't quite, a podium for Michael Andretti and that McLaren in 93 in Italy, but still, look, he'll take it. He didn't want the podium, he wanted a point, and he got it. He inherited 10th place. It was a good drive from the young American, and unfortunately, they couldn't cheer him and getting some points because everyone was in their cars and their RVs by the time the results came in, but a good day for Williams.
Yeah, certainly. I think Sargeant was super impressive today. He's had such a difficult time. Some of it sort of self-inflicted and some of it just, bad luck. For him to have a clean weekend and get that point in the bag, yeah, sure, it's inherited, but, you don't look a gift horse down the mouth at any point. And, he was very, very strong. To be in that position at the start, he was having a battle with Nico Hulkenberg sort of late into the race, and he made that overtake. So that actually ended up being very, very crucial. Albon, it wasn't actually his most impressive race, actually. He had a track limits penalty. Not that it really affected anything because he was about 6.5 seconds ahead of Sargeant, and then he ended up being 1.5 with the application of the penalty. It didn't change his race that much, but it wasn't arguably his most impressive one. His other point scoring drives for Williams have been, exemplary. So I think this one's sort of like a little bit lucky, but nonetheless, it's super important because, with Alfa Romeo bringing upgrades recently, with Haas bringing that big upgrade to Texas, there was that sort of like sweaty collar moment for Williams. Would they keep on to P7 in the Constructors' Championship? And with Alfa being really, really awful in Austin, with Haas not finding the new upgrades are the silver bullet they hoped for, it's super important for Williams, and they can just sort of like go into the final 4 races breathing a little bit easier that they've got that position on lockdown.
If you remember, I think it was in the build-up to Qatar, James Vowell said, we're sticking by Sargeant. We really would like to give him the seat next year. What we need to see is progress. And that drive today ticked those boxes. Okay, it's a wide open circuit. So, you don't have the threat of smashing into the barriers, but mistakes were few and far between. Obviously, wasn't struck by illness like he was in Qatar. No major mistakes. It was a steady drive. That's obviously paid off handsomely with a point at the end, fairly competitive alongside Albon. But is it too little, too late? I don't know, but it's a great headline result. And if he had, let's say, 8 or 9 of these drives, and then he might be a shoe-in for Williams next year. So he's matching the team criteria. It's just how late he's left it. But it was a nice result to see. Good feel good story.
We should talk about the winner of the Grand Prix, Max Verstappen, 50th victory in Formula One. And uncharacteristically, he was, very tetchy on the radio. We've heard those moments before, but it was a lot on the radio today to his race engineer. He didn't want to be talked to in the braking zones, which is probably fair enough because he was having this issue that he was managing. How much did that brake issue? I don't know if Red Bull or Max have talked about this afterwards. Matt, how much was that affecting his ultimate pace?
So the exact brake issue hasn't really been disclosed yet by Red Bull, but obviously Verstappen's feeling discomfort, and as you work to manage the brakes, then you obviously are compromising your lap time, and that then sort of snowball effect then had a knock-on effect for the tyre temperature. So I think it was like a compound issue for Verstappen. Certainly he was weaker in the opening stint than most people would have anticipated. It wasn't like the Spa 2022 style sailing up to first place within 3 corners or whatnot. I think the other issue you might want to latch onto now that Hamilton and Leclerc have been disqualified is just how much Verstappen was complaining about the bumps on the circuit. Now, our understanding most of the season is the RB19 has worked so well because it's got the ride height is really consistent, so they can keep it quite soft, and that's how Max nurses his tyres so well. But the fact he was complaining so much about the bumps, comparing this to a rally stage, saying it's not fit for F1, I've spoken to some engineers, and they think that from that they can infer that actually the Red Bull was set up really stiff today. So rather than, let's say, Hamilton and Leclerc wallowing and then kissing the ground and wearing away their plank, they think Verstappen, Adrian Newey's gone, it's a mega car, I don't care how my drivers feel, let's just lock it in position. And so whether as well that sort of non-compliant ride is why you saw a couple of lockups, the complaining, the frustration, because it just sort of made the task of driving the car that bit more difficult today. But nonetheless, 15th win of this, or Grand Prix win of the season, I think, and make a form, and it's a sad state of affairs to say this of F1 in 2023, but I think going from 6th to victory was the expectation today, so he satisfied that criteria too.
Well, that's what we have to say. What's on your mind? We'd love to read your comments below. Make sure you leave a comment. Any questions, thoughts, observations, we love to read what's on your mind. Thank you so much for watching. If you haven't clicked the thumbs up, then please do hit subscribe on the channel. That way you never miss one of these shows that we make. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you on the next one.